What happens when countries that have been watched for decades suddenly decide that the watching ends today? That question stopped being theoretical at exactly 8:47 this morning when Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Pedrino Lopez, signed Decree 0847, officially closing Venezuelan airspace to all American military and reconnaissance aircraft. This single move on its own would already be significant, but what followed made it historic. Within the next 18 hours, Cuba announced the same restriction mirroring Venezuela's decision almost word for word. Soon after, Iran confirmed the deployment of 4 warships to international waters off Venezuela's coast. This sequence was not accidental, not symbolic, and not reactive. It was coordinated. It marked a deliberate effort to shut down surveillance corridors the United States has treated as guaranteed since 1952. For the first time in modern history, 3 nations activated advanced air defense systems at the same moment, forming a unified denial strategy aimed directly at American air superiority in strategically vital regions. I spent 11 years analyzing security structures in emerging markets at the International Monetary Fund, and during that time I observed many challenges to American dominance in the air. There were warning moments before. In 2001, China forced an American EP-3 surveillance aircraft to land on Hainan Island after an aerial collision. In 2013, Bolivia diverted President Evo Morales' plane amid suspicions of American intelligence operations. Each incident created headlines and tension, but none represented a coordinated shutdown of airspace backed by layered air defense systems. What we are seeing now is fundamentally different. 3 states acting together have imposed a synchronized restriction supported by technology designed to contest American surveillance directly. That level of coordination has no modern precedent. The scale of the deployment explains why this matters. Venezuela has positioned 12 Russian S-300VM air defense missile batteries across 6 strategic locations. Each battery can track up to 100 targets simultaneously and engage aircraft at distances reaching 200 kilometers. Cuba has activated 4 Russian-made resonance radar systems capable of detecting stealth aircraft at ranges of 400 kilometers, a capability that directly undermines long-standing assumptions about invisibility. Iran has added its domestically produced Bavar 373 systems, widely considered comparable to Russia's S-400 platforms. Together, these assets form a dense access denial network spanning roughly 5 million square kilometers of critical airspace. This network reshapes the surveillance environment that has defined American hemispheric dominance since the early Cold War. It dismantles a core Pentagon assumption that American aircraft could operate freely in international airspace near sensitive targets with minimal risk. To understand why this moment arrived, it helps to look backward. The historical record shows decades of American airspace violations that gradually built the conditions for today's response. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis alone, American U-2 spy planes flew more than 400 unauthorized missions over Cuban territory. On October 27 of that year, 1 aircraft was shot down, killing pilot Rudolph Anderson. Despite the scale of these incursions, the United States never issued an apology for violating Cuban sovereignty. The message was clear: surveillance took priority over consent. That pattern repeated elsewhere. In 1988, the U.S. Navy shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 people aboard, including 66 children. The USS Vincennes fired 2 missiles from international waters while the civilian aircraft followed its scheduled route and climbed normally after takeoff. Later, Captain William Rogers received the Legion of Merit for his service. To Iran, that award symbolized not accountability, but indifference. Venezuela's experience followed a similar path. Under the banner of counter-narcotics operations, American airspace violations became routine. In 2001, Venezuelan fighter jets intercepted an unauthorized American reconnaissance aircraft over Zulia province. President Hugo Chavez filed formal protests with the Organization of American States, supported by radar data showing the plane conducted deliberate reconnaissance patterns for 42 minutes before interception. The scale of surveillance became undeniable in 2008, when U.S. Southern Command acknowledged at least 17 unmanned reconnaissance flights over Venezuelan territory between 2004 and 2007. RQ-4 Global Hawk drones monitored air bases and ports receiving Russian weapons, all without legal authorization. Iran reached its breaking point in 2011 when Iranian forces captured an American RQ-170 Sentinel drone that crossed into Iranian airspace from Afghanistan. When Washington demanded the return of the aircraft and its classified technology, Tehran refused. Instead, the drone was displayed on national television. Iranian engineers reverse-engineered the system and later developed the Shahed 171, a stealth-capable combat drone now exported to Russia, Venezuela, and Cuba. That single incident reshaped Iran's defense strategy and accelerated its push toward technological self-reliance. What these three nations have now deployed represents a dramatic leap forward in anti-Axis capability. Venezuela's S-300VM systems can engage targets at altitudes approaching 100 kilometers while tracking multiple threats at once. Cuba's resonance radar network extends early warning detection far beyond previous limits, exposing aircraft that once relied on stealth. Iran's Bavar 373 demonstrates a level of domestic technological independence that removes reliance on foreign suppliers for critical systems. Combined, these assets have rewritten the rules of access in regions once assumed open. The immediate response from Washington reveals just how disruptive this coordinated move has been. Within 24 hours, Defense Deputy Secretary Colin Kahl convened 2 emergency meetings to explore options for restoring reconnaissance without triggering shoot-down incidents. Every proposal failed. Raising flight altitudes proved ineffective because Russian radar systems in Venezuela can track aircraft up to 50 kilometers high. Expanding satellite surveillance faced prohibitive costs of roughly $300 million per launch, while predictable orbits reduce operational value. A third option, launching maritime reconnaissance from Caribbean carriers, collapsed when Iran warned it would consider closing the Strait of Hormuz if U.S. military presence near Venezuela increased. That threat alone exposed how regional actions now carry global consequences. This is where the story pauses, but the implications are only beginning to unfold. When 3 nations coordinate denial in one theater and force strategic reconsideration across multiple regions, the issue is no longer local, it becomes systemic. Diplomatic efforts moved just as quickly and failed just as fast. Secretary of State Antony Blinken attempted to contain the situation through negotiation, proposing a partial easing of petroleum sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for reopening its airspace to American aircraft. The offer lasted less than 2 hours. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil rejected it outright, stating clearly that territorial sovereignty was not a bargaining chip for market access. The message was unmistakable. Economic pressure and incentives, tools Washington relied on for decades, no longer guarantee compliance when states believe their security and autonomy are at stake. This rejection revealed a deeper shift. These governments are no longer acting defensively or reactively, but strategically, with defined red lines and shared resolve. The dilemma confronting American planners is unusually complex because the 3 countries involved sit astride surveillance routes vital to multiple U.S. strategic priorities. Venezuela occupies air corridors used to monitor drug trafficking flows from Colombia into the Caribbean. Cuba dominates the Florida Straits, through which roughly 40% of U.S. maritime trade passes. Iran controls leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for nearly 80% of Persian Gulf oil exports destined for Asia. Each location matters on its own. Together, they create overlapping pressure points that limit Washington's freedom of maneuver across hemispheres. The denial of airspace is not symbolic. It directly affects intelligence, collection, economic security, and military planning. The financial consequences are immediate and measurable. Since 2001, the United States has invested approximately $140 billion in global air surveillance systems built on the assumption that aircraft and drones could operate close to strategic targets with limited obstruction. Losing access over Venezuela alone forces U.S. Southern Command to spend an additional $700 million annually to achieve similar coverage. Each mission now requires 43% more fuel, along with increased aerial refueling support. These costs compound quickly, especially when similar restrictions emerge elsewhere. What once required routine patrols now demands complex, expensive workarounds with diminishing returns. Efforts to build alternative surveillance arrangements in the region have largely failed. Colombia declined requests to expand basing access for monitoring Venezuela, citing new defense agreements with Mexico that prohibit hosting operations against other Latin American states. Brazil maintains constitutional restrictions banning foreign military bases under all circumstances, leaving no room for negotiation. Guyana initially appeared open to U.S. proposals offering advanced air defense systems in exchange for reconnaissance flight permissions. That discussion ended abruptly when Venezuela signaled it would escalate long-standing territorial disputes over Essequibo if Guyana proceeded. Faced with that risk, Georgetown suspended talks. Even at the multilateral level, Washington encountered resistance. A proposed Organization of American States resolution condemning Venezuela's airspace closure as a violation of freedom of navigation failed when 18 Latin American countries voted against the U.S. position. Several governments that historically aligned with Washington expressed growing discomfort with surveillance practices they increasingly view as infringements on regional sovereignty rather than legitimate security measures. The political environment has shifted. Support can no longer be assumed. Attempts to reassert leverage through sanctions also fell flat. Washington warned of secondary sanctions against countries supplying air defense systems to Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. Russia and China ignored the warnings and announced nearly $4 billion in new weapons contracts with the three nations. This response underscored a critical reality. Alternative suppliers have eroded the power sanctions once held over military technology transfers. When states can source advanced systems outside Western-controlled markets, economic pressure loses much of its force. To understand why this moment was likely inevitable, it helps to step back and examine the structural dynamics at play. Great powers seek to maximize relative strength by dominating regions closest to their core interests. However, when a hegemon spreads its military commitments across multiple theaters while facing growing challenges near home, vulnerabilities emerge. The United States maintains extensive obligations in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. That global posture limits its ability to concentrate overwhelming force in the Western Hemisphere without weakening commitments elsewhere. This imbalance creates openings for coordinated resistance by secondary powers, especially when those powers share common threats. Political scientist Kenneth Waltz's balancing theory offers insight into why Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran aligned despite lacking ideological unity. When a dominant power grows too strong, other states form counterbalancing coalitions based on security needs rather than shared values. All three countries perceive the United States as an existential threat. From that perspective, cooperation becomes a rational survival strategy, regardless of differences in political systems, cultures, or regional priorities. Ideology matters less than shared vulnerability. The result is a challenge not just to American policy, but to the foundations of American air supremacy itself. Two pillars supported that supremacy for decades. The first was global reconnaissance dominance through a mix of satellites, manned aircraft, and drones capable of monitoring almost any region. That capability depended on access to international airspace near strategic targets. With Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran deploying systems capable of shooting down non-stealth aircraft at distances of up to 200 kilometers, that access has been sharply curtailed. Replacing existing platforms with fully stealth-based fleets would require investments of roughly $400 million per aircraft, a cost that makes comprehensive replacement unrealistic. The second pillar was deterrence through persistent presence. The assumption was simple. Regional actors would hesitate to act against U.S. interests if they knew American surveillance was constant. But when states demonstrate they can deny air access without triggering retaliation, that deterrence erodes. Surveillance loses its psychological power once it can no longer be sustained safely or affordably. And when monitoring weakens, so does influence. What makes this shift especially consequential is its demonstration effect. Other nations are watching closely. Algeria is negotiating purchases of Russian S-400 systems. Pakistan is exploring Chinese HQ-9 platforms. Nicaragua has formally requested Russian Panzer S-1 systems. Each of these states sees a model they might replicate, acquire access, denial technology, coordinate with partners facing similar pressure, and reduce exposure to external surveillance. The calculation is no longer theoretical. It is practical and increasingly attractive. This emerging pattern reflects a deeper realization spreading among middle powers. Defending sovereignty no longer requires matching a superpower plane for plane or satellite for satellite. It requires selective investment in systems that raise the cost of intrusion beyond what the dominant power is willing or able to pay. Venezuela's approach illustrates this logic clearly. By acquiring modern air defense platforms and coordinating politically with Cuba and Iran, Caracas transformed a long-standing vulnerability into leverage. The strategy does not aim to defeat the United States militarily. It aims to deny easy access, disrupt assumptions, and force strategic trade-offs. In doing so, it exposes the limits of a global posture built on constant surveillance. The potential domino effect is already visible. Countries experiencing American pressure are reassessing their options and recognizing that modest economies, when paired with advanced defensive technology and coordination, can impose real constraints on even the most powerful militaries. This is a fundamental shift in how middle powers approach relationships with hegemonic states. Where accommodation once seemed unavoidable, resistance now appears feasible. The cost-benefit analysis has changed, and with it, the willingness to push back. The financial implications go well beyond the immediate expense of rerouting surveillance flights. If multiple regions adopt similar access denial strategies, the cumulative cost of sustaining global reconnaissance and deterrence could exceed even the largest defense budgets. Surveillance systems are expensive not only to build, but to operate and protect. As airspace becomes contested, missions demand more fuel, more support aircraft, and greater risk tolerance. Over time, this erodes efficiency and strains resources. The question shifts from whether dominance can be maintained to whether it is economically sustainable. Technological evolution plays a central role in this transformation. Radar systems capable of detecting stealth, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and electronic warfare tools have advanced to the point where traditional American advantages no longer guarantee safety. Persistent surveillance, once a low-risk activity, now carries significant danger. The more advanced these defensive systems become, the narrower the margin of superiority grows. This does not eliminate American power, but it changes how and where that power can be applied. Alliance management adds another layer of complexity. Within NATO and other partnerships, there is growing concern about escalation and credibility. European allies, already cautious about entanglement, must weigh their own security priorities against operations that may provoke wider conflict. If access denial strategies spread, allies may question whether security guarantees based on air dominance remain reliable. Confidence in leadership depends on capability, and capability now faces visible constraints. The information warfare dimension of the coordinated airspace closure is just as important as its military effect. The action sends a message to multiple audiences at once. To American planners, it signals that assumptions about uncontested access no longer hold. To regional governments, it offers a template for asserting sovereignty. To domestic populations in Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, it reinforces narratives of independence and resistance. And to neutral observers, it demonstrates that coordinated defensive strategies can succeed without direct confrontation. The symbolism matters because it shapes future decisions far beyond this single episode. This coordination also points to the emergence of alternative security architectures. Backed by Russian and Chinese military technology, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran are building systems that operate independently of U.S.-led frameworks. These arrangements do not rely on Western approval, funding, or protection. They represent parallel structures designed to counterbalance traditional hegemonic influence. While still limited in scale, their effectiveness challenges the assumption that global security must flow through American-controlled channels. What these countries have demonstrated is not merely opposition to U.S. policy, but a broader lesson about power distribution in the modern world. With the right mix of technology, planning, and coordination, states with limited resources can protect core interests against far stronger adversaries. This does not eliminate conflict, but it changes its character. Power is no longer expressed only through projection, but through denial. The ability to say no and make it stick becomes as important as the ability to intervene. From Washington's perspective, this creates a strategic dilemma. Acknowledging the erosion of air supremacy risks undermining credibility. Ignoring it risks costly miscalculation. So far, official statements have avoided direct admission that global air dominance is no longer assured. Yet operational decisions tell a different story. Surveillance patterns are shifting, missions are being reduced or rerouted, and planners are recalculating risk in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The transition is happening quietly, without dramatic announcements, but it is happening nonetheless. The coordinated closure of airspace marks a turning point, not because it triggers immediate conflict, but because it alters expectations. When expectations change, strategies follow. What once seemed permanent now appears conditional. What once seemed inevitable now looks negotiable. This is how structural shifts in power begin, not with decisive battles, but with calculated moves that expose underlying limits. As these limits become clearer, the broader implications for global security planning come into focus. The challenge is no longer confined to Latin America or the Middle East. It touches the entire framework through which American power has been projected since the Cold War. Surveillance and reconnaissance have been the quiet foundation of that framework, enabling early warning, deterrence, and rapid response. When access to airspace is denied, that foundation weakens, and the ripple effects extend into every theater where similar technologies could be deployed. The Venezuelan case illustrates how quickly assumptions can unravel. For decades, hemispheric airspace was treated as effectively open for American operations, even when legal authorization was questionable. That environment shaped doctrine, budgets, and force structure. Aircraft were designed with the expectation that they could operate near targets without facing dense air defenses. Drones were built for endurance rather than survivability. When those conditions change, the systems optimized for them lose effectiveness. Retrofitting or replacing entire fleets is not just expensive, it takes time measured in decades, not years. This reality raises uncomfortable questions for policymakers. If air superiority can no longer be guaranteed everywhere, priorities must be reassessed. Choices become unavoidable. Resources devoted to maintaining presence in one region may come at the expense of another. Commitments that once seemed manageable in parallel may now compete directly. The global posture that defined American strategy assumes flexibility and reach. Access denial erodes both. At the same time, the countries adopting these strategies are careful to avoid actions that would justify direct military retaliation. By framing their moves as defensive and sovereign, they complicate escalation. Closing airspace is a legal act under international law. Deploying air defense systems on national territory is not an act of aggression. This legal grounding is part of the strategy. It forces Washington to respond within constrained political and diplomatic space, where overt force carries high costs and uncertain outcomes. The effectiveness of this approach has not gone unnoticed. Military analysts and planners in other regions are studying the details closely. They see that denial does not require parity in offensive capability. It requires enough deterrent effect to make intrusion risky and expensive. This logic aligns well with the realities of limited budgets and domestic political constraints. Defensive investments are easier to justify at home than foreign interventions, especially when framed as protection against sovereignty violations. There is also a cultural dimension to this shift. For many countries, decades of surveillance have been experienced not as security cooperation, but as intrusion. The ability to push back carries symbolic weight. It reinforces narratives of independence and dignity, particularly in states with long histories of external intervention. That symbolism strengthens domestic support for policies that might otherwise seem provocative. When sovereignty becomes tangible rather than abstract, public opinion tends to harden. From an American perspective, adapting to this environment requires more than technological fixes. It demands a reassessment of how power is exercised and justified. Surveillance without consent, once normalized, is increasingly contested. Allies and partners are more sensitive to domestic backlash and regional dynamics. What was once framed as collective security is now often perceived as unilateral monitoring. Rebuilding trust under these conditions is difficult, especially when alternative security partnerships exist. The coordination among Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran also highlights the importance of timing and messaging. Acting simultaneously amplified their impact. Had each country acted alone, the response might have been contained. Together, they forced a reevaluation that spanned continents. This demonstrates how coordination among geographically distant states can multiply influence when their actions intersect at critical nodes of global strategy. Distance matters less when technology and planning align. Looking ahead, the key question is not whether the United States can adapt, but how quickly and at what cost. Developing new reconnaissance platforms, investing in stealth, enhancing electronic warfare, and expanding space-based systems are all possible responses. None are cheap, and none fully restore the freedom of action once taken for granted. Every adaptation triggers counter-adaptations, continuing a cycle that favors defenders operating close to home. The broader shift underway suggests a rebalancing rather than a sudden collapse. American power remains immense, but its margins are narrowing. The space for uncontested operation is shrinking. This does not mean the end of influence, but it does mean influence will be exercised under tighter constraints. For a system built on global reach, constraint is transformative. What makes this moment historically significant is not just the technology involved, but the mindset it reflects. States once resigned to monitoring are now willing to challenge it. They are willing to accept risk, invest resources, and coordinate beyond their regions to protect what they see as core interests. That willingness marks a departure from the post-Cold War order, where resistance often took the form of rhetoric rather than capability. As this pattern spreads, the rules of engagement, both formal and informal, will continue to evolve. Surveillance and reconnaissance, once the invisible backbone of dominance, are becoming visible points of contention. And when the invisible becomes visible, it becomes debatable, resistible, and ultimately negotiable. At its core, what Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have demonstrated is not the collapse of American power, but the end of its unquestioned monopoly in the air. For 72 years, hemispheric air superiority functioned as an accepted fact, shaping how wars were prevented, how intelligence was gathered, and how influence was maintained without open confrontation. That era did not end with a dramatic clash or a single decisive moment. It ended quietly through calculated decisions to acquire defensive technology, coordinate policies, and enforce sovereignty in ways that could not be ignored. The transition is already underway, even if it has not yet been formally acknowledged in Washington. The long-term implications extend far beyond surveillance flights and radar coverage. When reconnaissance becomes expensive, risky, and politically constrained, its value as a tool of dominance declines. Persistent monitoring loses its deterrent effect when it cannot be sustained safely. This shifts the balance between presence and restraint, forcing policymakers to reconsider where influence truly matters and where it must be negotiated rather than imposed. In that sense, airspace denial becomes not just a military tactic, but a form of strategic communication. The emerging reality also reframes how global power is understood. Middle powers are learning that they do not need to match a hegemon's full spectrum of capabilities to defend their core interests. By focusing on denial rather than projection, they can reshape interactions on more equal terms. This approach does not guarantee stability, but it does change incentives. It encourages negotiation where coercion once prevailed and elevates sovereignty from a legal principle to an operational fact. For the United States, the challenge ahead is managing decline in certain domains without triggering instability in others. Global commitments remain extensive, and resources, while vast, are not unlimited. Every dollar spent overcoming access denial is a dollar not spent elsewhere. Every escalation carries global consequences in an interconnected system where actions in one region can provoke reactions in another. Strategic discipline becomes more important as freedom of action narrows. The demonstration effect continues to resonate. Countries watching this episode see that coordinated resistance supported by modern defensive systems and alternative suppliers can succeed without direct conflict. They see that sanctions and pressure lose effectiveness when states diversify partnerships and align with others facing similar challenges. This awareness alters calculations across multiple regions, from North Africa to South Asia to Central America. None of this means that surveillance and reconnaissance will disappear. They remain essential to modern security, but their role is changing. They are becoming contested capabilities rather than default advantages. That shift forces a broader rethinking of how security is provided, how alliances function, and how legitimacy is maintained. Power exercised without consent faces growing resistance. Power exercised with restraint may find new forms of influence. What emerges next will depend on how all actors adapt. If access denial continues to spread and coordination deepens, global surveillance may evolve into a more selective, negotiated practice rather than an assumed right. That outcome would mark a profound change in international relations, one driven not by conquest but by defense. The 72-year period of unchallenged American hemispheric air supremacy is over. What replaces it will define whether surveillance remains a cornerstone of dominance or becomes an increasingly costly capability with diminishing strategic return. The transformation is already visible, and the decisions made in response will shape the balance of power for decades to come.